Welcome to my YouTube channel, Surowicz Watercolor. At any time during this video, you can click on the subscribe button in the bottom right hand corner to subscribe to my channel. This is the narrated step-by-step tutorial for my painting Floral Abstract. This painting is centered around edge development and the positive and negative relationships between shapes. This is a light pencil sketch that I've done on an 11 by 15 inch sheet of 140 pound cold press watercolor paper. When I do this type of a painting, I often don't use any reference material, and that's the case with this painting. I began with a sketch done with a B pencil on an 11 by 15 inch sheet of 140 pound cold press watercolor paper. Often I'll begin with some thumbnail sketches in my sketchbook and perhaps value study. However, in this instance, I just drew a composition on the watercolor paper itself, and I'm just going to explore shapes, positive and negative relationships, and edges as I develop this painting. So it's pretty much going to be developed as I go through my painting process. If I wasn't going to take this approach, as I said, I would do a series of thumbnail sketches, just coming up with different compositions, and then perhaps do some value studies using Payne's Gray, and then I would go from there and do my sketch onto my watercolor paper and begin my painting. However, in this instance, as I said, I'm going to just develop the painting as I go through my painting process. Before I begin the painting, I'll go through the colors that I used. Gamboge, quinacridone and burnt orange, mauve, quinacridone violet, royal blue, sap green, and pyro red. I'll mention that I'm working on an 11 inch by 15 inch sheet of 140 pound cold press watercolor paper that is mounted to a piece of gator board with masking tape. My board is at about a 15 to 20 degree angle, and that's the angle that I'll be working at for the entire execution of this painting. I've begun my painting by applying a light wash, working wet on dry initially. However, I'm going to soften these edges with a fine mist spray bottle, and my paper is going to quickly become saturated. So as I continue with my painting process at this stage, I'll be doing a combination of working wet on dry and wet on wet, depending on where I'm applying this. And you can see how I've softened the edges, diffused the color using this fine mist spray, and you can see the effects of gravity as that paint slowly starts to go down the paper towards the bottom of the edge because of the angle that my board is tilted. And now I'm bringing in some sap green. I've started with the cool colors, and at this stage I want to try and keep my colors fresh, so I'm going to apply this cool range of colors, and then I'm going to dry my paper, and then I'm going to come back with some warmer tones using some gamboge. To this point I've used mauve, royal blue, sap green. I've let my paper partially dry now, so it's transitioned from being what I call saturated with a high gloss to a damp condition where the paper has a sheen to it. It's at this stage that you can push the paint and it doesn't flow back in. If you're doing this when it's saturated, it tends to flow back in, and it's ineffective using this technique. I like to scrape these linear marks in early in the process, and it gives me more information to work with. It gives me some ideas about design and shape relationships, and I'll paint around these and make them more pronounced as I move through my painting process. Now my paper is completely dry, and you can see that the cooler wash that I've put down has lightened up a bit. So I'm left with that light cool tone wash with some scraping in it. And I'm going to come in here with this warm tone now and let that just glaze over some of the white of the paper, and lightly it'll transition over top of some of the cooler tones. If I had done this when it was wet, the yellow tone and the violet would really work towards making the mixture neutral because of the opposite sides of the color wheel and the complementary nature there. So I like to put the cool down, then come back in after the paper's dried and glaze this warm tone over it, and it just keeps it fresher. I'm going to apply another wash of sap green, and well, I was a little tentative with it when I was working with the violet and the blue, because that when those colors mix together, it tends to tone it down. You can see there it's kind of a neutralized tone there. I want some brighter green, so I'm coming back in and putting some more of this sap green down, and I'm using my fine mist bottle to diffuse that color across the composition. If you've watched some of my other videos, you'll recall that I tend to use this foundation wash as a roadmap for color as I move through my painting process and further develop the painting. Now my paper is completely dry, so all the washes that I've put down are dry. They've lightened up a little bit. And now I want to bring out some of the geometric shapes that I had sketched in. So to do that, I'm going to apply some masking tape to the paper, and I'm going to use a magic eraser sponge to lift out some of the paint and bring out some of these geometric shapes. I'm going to take masking tape and I'm going to put it along the edge of some of the lines that I've drawn. And I'm not using a real aggressive masking tape. In fact, before I put it on my paper, I put it on my jeans to lessen the aggressiveness of the adhesive, because I don't want it tearing off the paper. And I put that on either side of the lines I've drawn there of that shape. Now I'm taking a magic eraser sponge that's loaded with clear water and just rubbing it lightly to lift some of that pigment. So that leaves me the edges, the white brings back that white of the paper there and defines the edges on these shapes that I've drawn. And I'm working on 140-pound cold press Lanaquarel, and I find that I can lift on it pretty well. I don't use a lot of staining colors, and it's not going to get back to the pure white, but it gets a very nice light. And this technique I'm doing lets some of those geometric lines, those shapes, run right into some of the organic shapes that I've left on the paper there, those floral elements that I have in my composition. As I mentioned at the start of this video, this painting really focuses on edge development and the positive and negative relationships between two shapes. So here you can see that by removing this some of the pigment, lifting the pigment, it creates a light edge on top of the tone that was in the wash. So it's a light on a dark, and that darker edge becomes the negative edge off that shape. I'm going to use the same technique in a few more places here. Put down the tape, and I'm just taking my wet magic eraser and rubbing that pigment off, and then it leaves a light shape. Do the same thing here. Rub that off, and you can see I've got a variety of shapes running together. You can follow that light and white paper all the way across the page. Now I'm going to start to work off some of the edges of these shapes. Some of them are areas where I've drawn a line to indicate a shape that I have there, and some of them are where I've used the tape and lifted off to clean out or to strengthen that edge. So now what I'll do is I'll develop along some of these areas where I lifted off the pigment and strengthen the contrast. I'm using a mixture of quinacridone burnt orange and gamboge to give me a dark warm tone, and I'm going to use that warm tone primarily in the areas where I had a wash of gamboge in the early stages. And as I do this, you'll see that I start painting around shapes. Some of them I've drawn in, some of them I just imagine, and I'll paint off of some of these edges to bring some areas forward and send some areas back. You can see here, now I put this dark tone off this edge, this lighter edge, and put a little bit of water there and just blot it with a tissue to soften that a little bit, and I get a nice gradation going away from that edge. And then here I'm working around some leafy shapes. It's kind of fun just to kind of play with some of the shapes and the layers and some of the overlaps. And again, you can see that I'm putting this warm tone in the area where I had the initial warm wash. As I said earlier, I think that I like to use that initial wash kind of as my color roadmap as I develop my painting. Here I'm going to paint on the exterior edge of this shape that I've drawn with pencil and bring it along the edge of the area where I lifted to, and then just soften it with water and gradate that away from that edge and just blot it softly with a tissue. Sometimes I'll just spray it also. Now I'm going to switch over and start using some sap green. This is pretty much pure sap green at this point, just sap green and water mixed in my palette. And as I get a little darker, I'll add a little pyro red to get darker and not get too raw. But I'm going to do some of the same type of brushwork with the green tone as I did with the burnt orange. And you can see I'm putting this over top for the most part in the area where I had the sap green wash to start the painting. Now I'm going to move up to the edge of this flower and strengthen the value there. So I'm at the point now where I start to build my values, start to go darker with these colors. And you can see how by defining that edge, I've started to send that light tone forward and send the darker area back. And you know, there's a lot to do with the painting technique I'm using right now that has to do with thinking about where your whites and lights are going to be. And I'm using direct painting to paint around those or gradate away from them and get lighter tones. There's a lot of ways to do it. You see me do in my landscapes, use masking often to create some of the light textures that I like to have and sparkle in my landscapes. That's one way to do it, and that's an application where I feel it works. In this instance, I feel the best technique to get the effect I'm after is just direct painting and painting around the whites and lights. Now I'm going to take some quinacridone violet with a little bit of mauve in it and just touch some of the areas there. It would be the center of this floral element, and then I spray it and let it diffuse that color and let it run. It keeps a little bit of a dark area where I first put the paint, and then that color starts to diffuse and gives some soft variation of that tone in that shape. And then we'll blot that with a tissue to soften that a little bit and remove some of the color. Just giving an indication here that there's a center of a flower. I just go back and forth with a little touch of pigment, a little spray, and blotting until I get the effect that I'm after. And I'll come back here a couple times probably and strengthen some of this. Now I'm going to come in into this area here on the top left corner with some darker valued cool tones using the royal blue and mauve. And just as I did in a few of the other areas, I'm starting to paint around the edges of shapes, and I'm trying to push some areas back, bring some things forward, and I'll experiment and just create some of the shapes as I go, especially some of the leafy shapes. Here I'm following still some of the kind of geometric edges which I drew in initially. And here I'm going with a stronger value off the area where I lifted the pigment from my initial wash, and it creates a nice area of contrast there. And you can start to feel that dark shape receding, and then that light area where I actually lifted off some of the pigment starts to layer on top of that and come forward. As I work with some of these different values and colors, I'll move about the composition from one side to the other, from the top to the bottom, down to the corner, and I'll just develop the painting as a whole unit. And so here you can see that I've hopped over the other page, and I'm trying to create some continuity and some harmony between different areas of my composition. I don't want to have the violet or the blue just isolated. There might just be areas where I have just a touch just to connect it visually with the other areas of my composition. And I'll vary the size of the areas where I'm applying the value, and just look for edges that I want to strengthen, or an area that I want to push back. When I take my brush to the paper, I want to have a reason for making the brush mark that I'm going to make. I don't want to just keep painting the paint. So right here I'm putting this value here because I want stronger contrast between the shape that's in the background and that leaf to the right and the area that's a geometric. So keep that in mind. Don't just put down marks just to make marks. If each and every brush stroke you make, you should know the reason that you're putting it there. It could just be to add some interest. It could be to strengthen an edge. It could be to balance color or value. But have a reason. Don't just paint because you think you're not done. As I move through my painting process here, I'm going to use a combination of just direct painting hard edge shapes and doing some glazing. Here you can see I put that mauve on the edge of that flower, and then I came in and softened it with a spray. But it starts to gently bring the light floral shape forward and the mauve area back, but it does it leaving a soft edge. And a lot of what I did early on was soft edge, and I started to get a little more hard edge, but I like to glaze and diffuse some of this color around, especially using a spray bottle. I like the effect that I get with it. That's a lot different than just taking a brush with clear water and softening it away from an edge. I did that with the mauve, and now I'm going to take some of the royal blue, and I'm going to use the same technique here. I'm going to glaze over top of some of the areas that I've already done some direct painting in. That area in the top left is that quadrant is really my focal point. So that's where I'm going to have the most detail, the most contrast, some of the harder shapes, so it's not just contrast of value and contrasting colors, but contrast of edge. Before, I was using the tape to mask an area that give me a clean edge as I used a sponge to lift off paint. Here, I'm going to put tape over to cover an area and give this edge while I apply a darker warm wash. So I'm taking the burnt orange and gamboge, I'm going to put a wash down, so this line that's going across the page goes from a light on a dark to a dark over a light as I gradate this wash here, and it transitions from dark to light moving right to left and light to dark moving left to right. But it's a nice transition. So as I get closer to the flower, you can see how that light line is really being defined by the negative space around it, and then it transitions on the right there to a positive image. I've masked off a few edges here to give me a guide as I come in with a dark valued royal blue tones that I'm putting down here. So I'm creating a dark edge along that tape. At the same time, I'm painting around some of the shapes that I'm trying to pull out of what I see there. This is a lot different than looking at a photograph and trying to paint something that you see. This relies on you to be creative and see shapes and values and edges in a way that's interesting, in a way that you can communicate it to the viewer. So as I paint this, I want that edge to be strengthened. I want to have a dark edge on the right side of that tape. But at the same time, I'm painting around shapes within that dark area. So I don't just come in and paint a dark blue rectangle. I'm working with what's within that space still and creating more and more shapes and relationships with shapes, where some are overlapping and some are light, some are dark, some are soft, some are hard edged. There's a lot of lost and found edges in here, which is something I haven't really mentioned yet. I'm going to come in with some more royal blue here and just diffuse that. I want that to be a little stronger with that blue in that area, in a few areas here. So when I put that down, it's a very liquid, fluid mixture that I have. There's some mauve and royal blue together. And then I come in with that spray, and I start very low, and I spray and pull away at the same time. And I don't always depress the button down all the way. In fact, most times I don't. Just a short blast to get that paint flowing the direction that I want. You can see there. Earlier, I scraped some of those light lines into the composition. Now that I've got some darker values down there and some stronger glazing, I'm going to take a nylon brush. This is just a little smaller than a 3/4 inch nylon brush, and I'm going to lift with the edge of this nylon brush. So the edge of the brush itself is very wet, but it's not saturated. It doesn't have a drop of water that's going to drip from it. It won't cut through the paint like that. So I dip it in water and I take off some of the excess on a Kleenex or a towel, and then I use the damp tip of it, and it's got kind of a nice sharp edge to it. It's a nylon, it's a stiff brush, but it cuts through the paint very well. And I use this to create some more interest, and these are things that I'll paint around as I continue through my painting process. And so I just take that clear water, the edge of that brush, agitate that a little bit, and lift it with a tissue. You can start to see some of those, and they'll be stronger elements the more I paint around them. But this is another thing that just gives me some ideas for some shapes and interesting overlaps. Now I've thoroughly dried my paper once again, and I'm going to come in with some more detailed brushwork. So I'm using my quill brush that I like to use for this type of brushwork, and I have a very dark valued mixture of mauve and royal blue. Sometimes it'll be just a royal blue, sometimes it'll be just a mauve, sometimes it'll be a combination. But you can see how much darker valued this is that I'm putting in right now compared to what I had before. The others were relatively dark, a little bit more than a dark middle value, but this is a pretty far down on the value scale. And so now this brushwork, I'm starting to paint around some of these shapes. So by putting these darker values off some of these lighter edges, it starts to create more depth, more overlap, more. It's about defining edges, which in turn define shapes and the relationships between shapes. That helps you understand a little bit more what's positive, what's negative. And just as I did before, I'll move around my composition. So I'm trying to play up some of these areas of interest that were created by overlapping shapes and by some of these linear marks where I lift it off. And I just try to be creative with my shape making and the design process as I move through my painting process. And this does get a bit repetitive here, so I'm going to, at times, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here because this can get very monotonous. It does take a little bit of patience to paint like this. Here, as I've moved up the page, you can see that I'm using the mauve and the royal blue in the areas where I've already been developing that color, the royal blue or the mauve, and some touches of quinacridone violet here and there, but not a lot. And I'll come back in with some darker value warm tones that I'll work in the warm areas of the gamboge and the quinacridone burnt orange. Then I'll also come in with some darker value green that I'll build on top of the green washes that I had started to build and lay in. And then later on, I'll put some linear marks, and some of those marks will stretch across the paper and go over top of different colors. But this brushwork here, as I start to carve out some shapes and make some edges a little stronger and define a little bit more the relationship between two shapes, it's dark, it's very specific, and I pretty much match up those brush marks and color wise with what I've put down in the wash. At this point, this is going to be very repetitive. I'm going to speed it up for about 3 minutes at 3x speed, set to music, and then I'll resume my narration. This way you won't get bogged down. And now we'll get back to the narration. You can see that I've switched over to a darker valued warm tone. This is quinacridone burnt orange for the most part, with a little bit of gamboge here and there, but for the most part it's quinacridone burnt orange. And just as I did with the blue and the violet tones, I'm painting around shapes, and I'm painting also some positive shapes. Here you can see just diffusing the color. And here, as I did before, I'm moving around my composition. And you can see, hopefully, some of the areas where I'm putting this darker value, this brushwork. You can see that I'm starting to define some of the marks that I lifted out with my brush, or marks where I scraped out early on. You can see that I'm painting on either side of those shapes on the edges, and by doing that, I start to make those stand out more. So I like to create those on or early in my process, and that just gives me some interesting shapes and overlaps to play up as I go through my painting process. Here you can see I've put a leaf shape just underneath, coming out from the area that's kind of the geometric shape, and then it hits that area where I had lifted out some of the pigment, and then I just make that leaf shape look like it's going underneath and coming out the other side. And then there's multiples of those linear marks, so it looks kind of like two blades of grass, or just grassy elements that are going over top of that leaf, but they're a lighter value. Here again, you can see by putting that leaf underneath, I start to bring out that area that I lifted out. So I continue to do this as I move around the composition. Here I've done some of the same brushwork with the dark green over top of the areas where I had the green wash, and now I'm going with a darker valued green. So this is sap green with a little bit of royal blue to deepen the value, and then a little pyrrole red to make it so it's not such a blue green. And now I move around my composition, taking some of this very dark valued green and cleaning up some of the edges of some of the marks I have. I'm strengthening the value contrast between shapes, helping to find some edges where I think it needs more definition. I want to make sure that I take some of these dark values to the edge of my composition. I don't want it to feel like the whole thing is floating within the frame of reference. I want to feel like this continues on beyond the edge of this my paper. And so some of these areas here, I'm taking some of these darkest values from the edge and bringing them in, and it just makes it feel complete. It's not really a vignette that I'm painting, so I want to make sure that I involve the edges of my composition. I'm really at the point or I'm just putting on my finishing touches. So these are pretty much dark value brush marks, just strengthening a value in an area where I feel it needs it, or cleaning up an edge, or again helping define an edge. Now, to continue with the feeling of some of these linear kind of grassy shapes coming out of this composition, I'm going to take some dark value tones and make some of these linear shapes. So I have a combination of some light value linear marks that are moving through my composition, and then they're going to be complemented by some of the same with the darker values, and I'll switch the colors too. But in this case, some of these colors, like that purple, is going to overlap, say, the warm tone there. I'm not as concerned as staying in the boundaries of the color I mapped out initially. And I'm using this quill brush right now, but I'm going to switch over and go to a liner brush that does a better job. It has more control for this application. So I've switched to my liner brush here. This is the #1 liner brush. And now I've got a dark warm tone here, the burnt orange. And I'm making some of these same linear marks. And you can see how I start and I stop and lift and start again. This is to give the suggestion of these shapes going over and under other shapes. I don't want to just put them all floating on top of the composition. I want them to feel part of it, so I weave them through my composition, and that just helps validate some of the edges and some of the depth through the overlapping that's going on. When you bring one of these linear marks to the edge of a leaf and then you pick it up on the other side, that just helps reinforce the edges of those leaf shapes. I've switched to a darker green tone now, still using my #1 liner brush. And what I do normally, though, is I originate the brush stroke in the zone, if you will, of the color that I have on my brush, and then I take it and overlap some of the other areas. So here I've got this, I've switched back to a violet tone, and now I'm originating those for the most part in the areas where the violet is, and then I overlap some of the other areas. But you can see that this helps give some direction, it creates some activity in the painting that makes it more interesting. And now I'm going to put a white mat around this, as I like to do, so you can get rid of the tape and the board. And there you have my painting, Floral Abstract. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to my channel and join my mailing list so you receive the latest information and updates. You can do that by clicking on either one of the boxes on the right side of this screen. I hope you enjoyed this video, and thanks for watching.